I'm George Wright, and I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I am, well, strolling for president, I would say, or maybe running if things become more urgent. I want to do it in a way that's relaxed and spacious, that um, it's not a struggle to the death, as it were. And I, I feel like I have an interesting perspective that could be that I will present. And if it's useful, if it how would I say that? If it's yeah, I guess if it were useful, if it could be heard and maybe something could shift from that in a way, that would be lovely. That would really be lovely. And maybe if it resonates, what I can do or say resonates, who knows? It's a time of change and surprising things. I really love this country, and and there's a certain feeling. Like, I've traveled a lot. I've been around the world and all of that kind of stuff. And I come back here, and we're not perfect and all that kind of stuff, but there's a sense of freedom. And people say, well, what's freedom? It's this, and you can argue all about that kind of stuff. But I can feel it, just like you can feel love. You don't have to define love and split hairs about love and parse the whole thing. Love is love, and you know it when you see it and when you feel it. And this country has a sense of freedom and an optimism that is just really, really beautiful. And that it goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. I mean, good God, that is just so special in this world. There's no other continental power that does that. I mean, the Atlantic, we've got 3,000 or more miles to Europe, and the Pacific, we've got even more till you reach the other shores of Asia. So it gives this sense of expansion and almost clarity, because you're just set in this thing. And then we go up, even with our friendship with Canada and our state of Alaska, we go up to like the North Pole and the Arctic Circle. It's just beautiful. And there's something about the creation of this country in the late 18th century that through some act of divine providence, or whatever you call it, all of these really smart, intelligent, good-hearted people happen to find themselves together in this country. And they made this nation, the likes of which had never been seen before. And they read widely. They read everything they could get their hands on about how the Greeks, Greek democracy was, Roman democracy, Roman rule, Roman Senate, all of this kind of stuff, all the works of the French Enlightenment, Locke and Montesquieu and all these people. And they knew American Indian, Native Americans on intimate, friendly terms, and they took from them, they gathered ideas from them. It was really amazing. And then they forged this union. And just the language of that part of the Declaration where, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was written apparently mostly by Jefferson, and some of it by Adams, and influenced also by Franklin. But there was an election in 1800. Washington had 2 terms, and Adams had 1. And Jefferson was Adams' vice president. But in the election of 1800, Jefferson ran on his own ticket, or a separate ticket, separate party. And there was a split between Adams and Jefferson. And Jefferson was more, he wanted favored states' rights and an agrarian democracy, a democracy of farmers and small and people with land holding farming, an agrarian society. And Adams and Hamilton, and to, I think, a pretty large extent, Washington, favored a strong central government with currency and banking and laws and armies and navy and all of that, the central federalized federal power. And it was extremely virulent, that election. People were calling each other cohabiting with whores, that their mothers were prostitutes. I mean, really, really vile. And some historians say far more vile than anything we've seen in recent times. The result of this was that Adams and Jefferson did not speak or communicate for 11 years. Until the summer of 1811. And they had a mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, who was a famous physician in Philadelphia and also signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he wanted them reconciled and had been trying for years. And he came up to Adams' farm in Massachusetts and I forget what he said, but he was trying a reconciliation. And Adams just sort of almost blurts out, "I always loved Jefferson." And I still love him. And Benjamin Rush goes to see Jefferson, or writes to Jefferson and tells him what Adams has said. Jefferson's heart is melted. January 1st, the following January, so about 6 months later, Adams writes a letter to Jefferson. And the friendship is healed. It begins. This book, almost 600 pages of letters, some of which are 20, 30 pages long in book print. So in hand script, enormous letters. And they're talking about everything: science, literature, French, the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, there's this one page. Adams is writing to Jefferson some quotation in Greek, in there's French, there's Latin. I mean, it's not just one letter. The whole thing is covered with these musings of these minds that are just brilliant. It's incredible. It gives me it gives me goosebumps to read it. And the elevated language is just, it's sublime. It's John Adams to Jefferson. Quincy, Massachusetts, 19th April, 1825. I have lost your last letter to me, the most consolatory letter I've ever received in my life. What would I not give for a copy of it? Your friend to all eternity, John Adams. 10 weeks later, on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was 83 years old. At 12:50 p.m., almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he passes. John Adams, born in 1735, was 91. Shortly before he dies, at 6:20 in the evening, about more than 5 hours later, his last words were, Thomas Jefferson survives. This gets me to thinking, like, what would it be like to have a current of love running through everything? And here are two men who did it. I mean, before 1811, that 11 years it took them to heal, there was rancor and anger. And, on both sides, Abigail Adams, John Adams' incredible wife, who was behind the scenes, but in my mind, equal in her stature and insight and steadiness, that without her, it's just hard to see how the revolution would have succeeded as it did. But she had tried to broker a reconciliation, but then she got caught up in her own angers, and it triggered Jefferson, and it didn't work. But when it worked, it really worked. So here are two men, bitter enemies at one time, and loving friends earlier, and they could do it. So what would it be like to have a current of love that runs through everything, so that everywhere we went, in the world even, we could feel loved and cherished and love other people? That we could really feel the earth is a nice place. that people would delight in one another. And what would it be like to have a broad band of forgiveness?
Yes.
Running through everything. because it just occurs like forgiveness. It just doesn't free the other person you're nixed on. It frees yourself. Because then you don't have to spend all that time devising imagined punishments and tortures. I'm speaking from my own personal experience. And I'm just because I'm saying that, I'm not saying I'm free of it. I'm saying this is I want to be. I'm still go around judging people all the time. But I think there's hope. And I'll tell a little story. Like once I was in Whole Foods and I was walking in the main aisle and I was just judging everybody like, oh, look at that dress. She's no sense of color and like, oh, who does he think he is, all puffed up? Blah, 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 on and on and on. But then I saw people smiling at me. And I'm thinking, well, this is odd. Why is this happening? And then I realized I was smiling at them.
You were smiling.
I was smiling at them. It was a little smile,
Yes.
It was something at me that I was kind of delighted at them, even as I was judging them. So I think the kind of like love in a way dominates. It's a dominant force, if you've got love and you've got all this judgment, the love kind of superimposes itself as well. But I don't know if it's true, but I like to think of it. And I'd like to give, I have some of these stories. I guess they're stories, but I think they're true. But anyway, that I've come across in the last, 20 or 30 years of my life. And the first is, there was in the late 19th century, there was somewhere on the East Coast, a dark, rainy night, cold and windy and blowy. And this man, who was then a young boy, he later became a well-known American author, and I forget his name, but was there. He was probably 8 or 9 years old. He was there all by himself, well, not all by, with his grandmother. And comes this heavy knock on the door, and the grandmother goes and opens the door, and there is a big hulking man, sopping wet, not looking too friendly, at the door. And she said, "Oh, please come in. You look tired and hungry. Please come in. We'll get you something to eat." And he came in, and she said, "Well, you have wet clothes. My husband isn't here, but I have some of his clothes, and you could change into them and dry yours by the fire, and we'll make dinner." And she did that. And then a little bit later, she looked at him and she said, "You look like you're frightened." And that was all. That she didn't go into it any more than that. Just left it. So they had dinner and they sat down by the fire. And then she and her grandson went to sleep by the fire. When they woke up the next morning, the man was gone. Later, some kind of neighbors or authorities or sheriff or something came by and said, "Oh, have you seen this person?" And they described him, that he had been going around and killing people. He had gone from one house to another in this valley or this part of and knocked on doors and just murdered everybody. Went on to the next farmhouse, did the same thing. theirs was the only one. That he didn't do that. And I think it was her love, her compassion, and her, in a sense, you could call it forgiveness, her non-judging of him. She just saw him as somebody who was suffering and needed what she could offer him. And she did. In war-torn Europe during the Second World War, there was some country adjacent to Germany that had been conquered by the Germans. And in this town or village or something, German soldiers had killed people in the town. And there was this one family, so there's this woman that was not killed. And some of her relatives, I'm not sure whether it was children or parents or aunts and uncles, but they were killed by the Germans, or the Nazis. The Nazi army had an order that a certain amount, like 3 or 4 or 5 German soldiers would be billeted, means stationed in private houses, and people would take care of them and feed them. She took care of these soldiers like they were her own children. She washed their clothes, she ironed their clothes, she made sure their bed linens were clean, she cooked them food. She was like a mother. And they were just blown away that a woman who had every right to be outraged could do that. It seemed almost beyond human. But she did. And I think the story came through those soldiers that witnessed it and were transformed. There's another story that comes from World War II, and it's about a man, Jack Schwartz, who was Dutch. And later in the 70s, I knew Jack Schwartz. He was a clairvoyant and a healer, and he would do sessions, and I had several sessions with him in the San Francisco Bay Area in 73 or 4 or 5, in that area. And he was well known in healing communities and also in the regular medical community because he could pass a knitting needle through his bicep and there would be no blood. He could control his bleeding. He could control pain. And this manifested in him at a very early age. So he was born, I think, in the early 30s, something like that. So he was in the Dutch resistance against the Germans. And he was caught. And so he knew he would be tortured. But he thought, like a cocky young man, I'm Jack Schwartz. I can control pain. I can control bleeding. They don't know who they're dealing with. Well, he was put on a table and he was beaten by this man with a black leather mask. And he passed out from the pain. It was too much. He couldn't bear it. And when he came to, he looked up at the man and he said in German, Ich liebe dich. I love you. And then his wounds spontaneously healed. The man put down the whip and led Jack Schwartz out the door to freedom. All these things are part of human experience. It's all something that any of us could do. So if we had a world like that, where love and forgiveness just ran rampant, I mean, it would be really amazing. It would really be amazing. I think it's almost too much to bear. In a way, it's good. It will take us a little bit of time to get there, because it's like a person starving or thirsty. Someone who's really thirsty for weeks in the desert, you just don't give them all the water they want. They'll overdo it and they'll die from too much water. Or somebody who's been starving, you don't give them, you start really slowly and their body acclimates. And I think it's the same thing with, I don't know if it's true with love and forgiveness. Maybe that puts you in another realm entirely. But I mean, it's important to have the inspiration. It's important, like, let's go there. What do we do to get there? I think that's really important. That people can do that is that, in my mind, there is not a shadow of the doubt that everyone in them has that beauty and clarity, that everyone's got love inside them. Everyone's got that kind of love. It might be really, really buried. Like, boy, you need a backhoe to get down to the bottom of where the sweetness is, but it's still there, It's just a very good disguise. And disguise the limit. but 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 I think there's another piece that follows that, and that goes with this thing of all men are created. Always works. It's always a tearjerker for me. Oh God. That all men are created equal. For some reason, in the last, whatever, 100,000 years, I don't know the time frame, but there's this leveling of society, different levels. Like, people are at the top and they've got money, or they've got position, they've got power, they've got looks, they've got talent, they're musical, they're film stars, whatever the thing is, they're like on this high level, and people look up to them and they respect them and they think they're at the top and we're at the bottom. And that it's better to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something than somebody who digs ditches or does plumbing or does manual labor. And I don't see that at all. So, by way of background, I grew up in a middle-class family in the suburbs of New York City. I was born in 1943, and my father taught biology in high school and coached the track team. My mother stayed at home until I went away to college, and then she worked in the bank as a, you know, like a teller or something. So not fancy. Through some miracles, I went to Yale Architecture School and got my master's. Before that, I got my degree in history and art history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Two schools I really, really loved, each in their different way. So, you know, Yale was a fancy place. San Francisco, where I moved, and it hit a recession in '73, and this house, and it wouldn't sell, and there's no mortgages around, and I do dermite and dry rot repair work. Coming out filthy with, dust and working these 18-inch crawl spaces, and I blow out black snots at night. And there were dead cats and rats around that had been flattened by, being there for 20 years. This kind of stuff. So it was good. It took me down a notch. And then after that, I sort of crawled my way out of debt and so forth, and was a general contractor working for other architects and other clients. So I was working with subcontractors. And I really came to know how working men are and what they think and do and all this kind of stuff. And there was I remember there were two times in particular that were really, well, I don't know what to say, but the first was the plumbing, was this guy, and I can't even remember who the plumbing contractor was, but he had done this copper plumbing, probably it was some kind of bathroom, and it was so beautiful. Every soldered joint was sweated and wiped, so it was clean. So not only was it like this shining copper event, but there was this logic to it. It just was, oh my God, there's no other way that this plumbing could have been done so elegantly and so beautifully. It just hung together. And I thought it was like reading Plato's Symposium, like what I'd done 20 years before. And I'm a little bit thick on the board when it comes to that kind of stuff. So I had to read it like 2 or 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 times before I get what the heck he's saying. And then I got it. And then it's like the arguments or the prose or the whatever, the whole thing unfolded like an avalanche, like it just sheeted down, like there was no other way. It was this sense of gorgeous inevitability. And that's what that plumbing job was like. That, you can't do that with dumb in the head. You can't do that with dumb in the head. That takes experience, and it takes probably even a sweetheart
Yeah. Yes.
to be able to let the beauty flow through. And it was beautiful. Maybe you could say that was love. It couldn't have come out of impatience, and I've got to get the job done because blah, 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 all that kind of zoo. You couldn't do that. It had to be somebody who had an I don't know, maybe I'm just fantasizing, but that had an open heart and real knowledge, that had been doing that work for years. And there was another guy. This guy was really lovely. I remember this guy's name. His name was Joe Freoff. I think he lived in San Leandro in the suburbs in the East Bay of San Francisco. And he hung drywall. That was his profession. And he was kind of a chunky guy. He had married, probably had 2 or 3 kids. A very sweet guy. And well, most people, when they would drywall, there'd be some big pieces of sheetrock left over, 4x4 sheets, or, like big pieces. Joe didn't do that. He somehow could just look at the job and know how to put it together. And at the end, there'd be this little pile of niblets on the floor. It was just, I don't know, it was just so happiness. It was such happiness to witness that. And, and he could talk and do the work. It just happened, things would go up and you go, oh, he's just on that wall. And it wasn't like, grunting or struggling like a lot of people during trial. I mean, it's heavy work and it really can wreck your body if you're not doing it right. And he was just like, oh, putting Hallmark greeting cards back in the rack at some stationery store. It was just that easy and flowing. And then in my work here, I now live in Santa Fe, and I have 4.5 acres that has 6 buildings, 4 of which are adobe. And there's a mobile home and a chapel. There's all this stuff. And we're doing work. We're still doing work. At least 3 hours a day I work. And it's really fun. And I'm working with this young man, Jared, who's doing a work trade. He stays in the mobile home. And he has really no experience with carpentry. And here I am, I'm 77. I've been doing this stuff, I don't know, since I was like 20 something, and my father was a good carpenter, and my great-grandfather in England was a carpenter, and there's carpentry all over the place. So, we're doing something, and he says, like, oh, why don't you do it that way? And he's right. Swallow a little hard, have to admit it. So, it just reinforces my sensibility that everyone matters and everyone has a different perspective. Nobody can see everything. And there's a story that my friend Bill Dempster, who's a carpenter in California, worked for me in the early 70s. And he was in the Navy. He's about 10 years older than me. He was in the Navy during the Korean conflict. He was an officer. So at one point, there was this big Navy flotilla off some sea in Korea, and there's battleships and aircraft carriers and destroyers and the whole 9 yards. And it had been planned for months at the highest levels in the Pentagon, months and months and months. So they're on deck of this ship and they're being briefed. And this guy is saying, oh, well, we're not going to have those, they used to have those blinking lights that they would shutter that would be like Morse code so they could transmit messages. Oh, we're not going to have those because and we're not going to have radio contact, so the enemy won't know what we're going to do. So Bill raises his hand. He says, but sir, how are we going to be able to communicate? Dead silence. Pin drop. Nobody had thought of that. The highest levels in the Pentagon for months and months. Nobody thought of it. So obvious. We need everybody. Not only for themselves, but for us. So I live in Santa Fe. I have a little old Subaru. Well, it's not that old. It's 2007. It's a sweet little car. It's an Outback. And I keep a little stash of ones to give them. People ask for money at the traffic lights. And I drive up, and I never feel ennobled by witnessing somebody poor like that or in bad straits. It's just, it hurts my heart. And my lovely little car doesn't seem so lovely anymore. I think it just doesn't work anymore. I mean, recently I found out this a few months ago that there are 9.1 million people that die of starvation every year. And it's improved. I mean, 10 years ago or something like that, it was 20 million, 30, 40, it was 40 million. So it's moving in a good direction. But still, there's 9.1 million people that are dying of starvation every year. And there are something like 787 million people that are in terrible malnutrition to the point where it's affecting their brain function and their mobility and that kind of thing. So I think whether we realize that stuff or not, it has an impact. And it doesn't, it's not a recipe for a happy life. Because I think we're at a point where there's enough to go around. I've been doing some numbers. I'm a numbers guy from all my years of general contracting. But so, for instance, you take the United States. There is a gross domestic product of, I think it's close to $21 trillion a year. And you divide that by the population of the United States, which is about 328, 338, something like that. It comes out to $65,000 a person. Now, if you take, so that's per person, but you still have to pay for all the federal government infrastructures and all their programs and the state and the local, all of that. That's about a quarter to a third of the gross domestic product. So you take a third off 65,000, you've got about 40-something thousand that every man, woman, and child in this country could receive if everything were, if everything were divided equally. So that gives you an idea of the wealth that we have. So, I'm not saying, I mean, people who are conservative might say, well, we're not going to. And I'm not saying that we should do that right now, that we should just level everything and give everybody equal. Because like I was saying before, you give a starving person too much, they'll overdo it and they'll kill themselves. So you just don't go from people who are in abject poverty to just a lot of money. They wouldn't have the tools of how to deal with it. Just like a lot of people, or perhaps most people, who have won the lottery, their life becomes miserable. But I'm using this more as an educational thing, like what can you do? And so you take the world. The world gross domestic product is about $81 trillion. And you divide that by 7.6 billion, and you've got $10,664 per person. Well, and then to say you take a third off of that. So it's about $7,000 a year per person. maybe not so much in northern climes where you need extra food and shelter and it's cold and heating and all that. But, a family of four, 7 times 4 is 28,000. I mean, you could almost do something like that in this country. Barely, but you could almost do something like that. And then further things like if you go back to the starvation and the malnutrition, you can generally feed people for about 1,000 a year, especially in sort of like where most of the starvation is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, and other parts. And you could feed people for 1,000 a year. So 1,000 a year times 9.1 million, it's about $1 billion a year. And that is just eminently doable and should be done. I mean, and I know, the answer is not simple, that there's fighting going on and people using food as a weapon, and you have to, there's a lot of diplomacy and tricky delivery questions, how you get the food targeted to where people need it. But with drones and blimps and airships that can go through and satellites that can pinpoint it, I think that could be much easier. And the malnourished people, you do that, $1,000 a person, that's $1 trillion. So the world domestic product is 89.9 trillion. So you take what's that? 10%. It's like 1.2 or 1.3% of the gross world product, and you've got that potentially linked. So I think this all points out that we're really in a different playing field in the world right now. We're in a different playing field. Like starvation was eliminated in England and the Netherlands sometime in the 18th century. They had really good farming techniques. They were smart, they were intelligent, they had progressive governments. There was no more starvation. There was no more famines in the Netherlands and in England after that point. They were in Central Europe, they were in Germany, they were in France, but not there. And now we have it within our reach. Have that for the whole world. And since we're all connected, and more all the time, we know what's going on, and we need everybody. We need everybody in their full blossom of their intelligence and their humanity. There's just no other way it can be done. It's not fair and it's not right. It seems, as I see it through human history, we've been on a thing of scarcity. Things have been scarce. And there was not enough food. There was just not enough to go around. So it had to go to a small group of people that could keep at least some semblance of civilization going, so that monks could write the Bible and that people could make beautiful music and architecture and works that inspire. That was needed. So that kind of layering of society was needed. But now it's not. It's just not needed. There's enough to go around for everybody. And I think we should take a chance. and do it and see what happens. I think there's this indomitable human spirit that comes up, that grows when it's given a chance. And I think that's what we should do. I want to talk about happiness, because all men are created equal, endowed by our Creator, and pursuit of happiness. What are just an incredible 3 words. What an incredible 3 words. But happiness is a choice. And I think that's not widely recognized. And in our kind of our mercantile buying and selling culture, many people think that happiness will be that next garden cart or lawnmower or Mozart record or RV or whatever thing you're really into. But there was a study done, it was published in the New York Times, an advertising or a group of people that consortium of retailers or something made the study. And they found out that what really gave people pleasure was the anticipation of acquiring something. Once they have it, it just becomes ordinary. It's just, it's part of the furniture of their life. But then there's something else there that's like, the attachment to that tractor, something that'll furrow the field. There's always something. So there's never really an end point. It's always kind of like a moving target. And that's almost like these Buddhist texts I've read over the years, like, happiness, this satisfaction of material desires is endless. You never get there. So you're not going to really get there in that method. And also, I think with wealth, it's so interesting. Like I remember some years ago when I lived in New York and go to the Upper East Side, which is, then the wealthiest zip code in the United States. And people are beautifully dressed, the most, the whole thing. But you look at the faces. Pretty grim. Definitely not happiness. Definitely not happiness. Not smiles. Go over to the West Side, which at that time had a lot of Puerto Rican families. And people are sitting out on the steps of their brownstone buildings, and there's kids in the street, and they're drinking beer and playing music, and laughing and joking. You go like, wait a minute. What's going on here? I think this is where kind of love comes in. That, like, I'm not lovable. And what do I do? And well, I'm going to show them. I'm going to become the richest person or the most famous or the most notorious. I'm going to become the most hideous criminal or something. But I think more it's like money and power. Money and power will do that. People will be afraid of me. People will seek me out for whatever. People will want me. People will be envious. I remember when I lived in Bayside, Queens. This is about 10 years ago. And I was crossing the street in downtown Bayside. And this man is in this obviously brand new, bright red Cadillac convertible with beige leather seats or something. It was just the whole 9 yards. And he was a big, sort of burly guy, probably some kind of plumber who made it really rich or something. And I looked at him, and my first impulse was like full of disgust. Like, oh, you big fat pig, in your car. But then something in me softened. And I looked over at him. He was probably, because I was here on the sidewalk, he was right there. He was maybe 3 or 4 feet away. And it was a warm day in May. It was a really beautiful day, probably late morning. And I said, that's a beautiful car. Just like that. That's a beautiful car. That's a really beautiful car. I just repeated it. And he looked like he was about to cry. And he said, thank you very much. And I think he just wanted to be noticed. He just wanted to be complimented on his taste, which for him reflected his personality. It was just, that'll always be in memory, like how he, thank you very much. And it was from the bottom of his heart. There was feeling in his voice. So I think someone who's in political life, in some form of responsibility, can talk about these things. Like Teddy Roosevelt used to talk about the presidency as being the bully pulpit, where you could speak your ideas. Sometimes there are vast changes in history, like, my specialty was architecture and history. So you take the Gothic cathedrals. All are built in this amazing 30 or 40-year period, or maybe it's 20 or 30. And it was fueled because there was an agricultural surplus. They learned how to drain the swamps. They learned how to cut down forests and make agricultural land. There were improved plowing methods. There's a whole revolution in agriculture, which meant there was a surplus of food so they could pay the architects and the masons and the builders to build that thing. So there are times, and really it's amazing, you look at it, 11, 20, 11, 10, 30, 40 years, there was this explosion of, it's like a little renaissance. It's a time of love where the devotion to the Virgin Mary comes before the church is more Christ-centered and Christ in judgment and at the last judgment and heaven or hell. And then there becomes this tender devotion to Mary that is just, people are in a different mode. Things sometimes can pivot like that. The Renaissance comes in. It was not something like, looking back, it came in or something and we see it. They knew it. They could feel it. There was an atmospheric change over a 1 or 2 year period, and suddenly they were in a different world. Suddenly they were out of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and into classical learning, and perspective is discovered, and people, there's this wonderful letter this woman writing to another woman friend. I can't get my husband out of his drawing room or his study or his atelier, whatever they called it. He's discovered this new thing called perspective. I can't get him out of there. So there are these times in history where things just pivot. And you never know. We might be in one of them. We might wake up, suddenly the world is different. What else is there? I think there's two little things I'd like to say about wealth. I remember reading Mother Teresa saying that, there's this whole thing about like, oh, poor people are poor because they don't have the energy or the gumption or the fortitude or the intelligence or whatever to be rich. They're at fault. There's something wrong with them. So Mother Teresa said, she said, rich people are rich because they do not have the fortitude to be poor. They have to claw their way. I don't know if she said claw, that wouldn't be kind of a Mother Teresa thing, but they have to do anything they can do to get wealthy because they cannot, they can't stand it. They cannot tolerate poverty. So that's another way of looking at it. And I think another way is you could say this pursuit of wealth is kind of like the booby prize. It's kind of like the booby prize because you never get satisfaction. You just don't get satisfaction. It's always one step away. Is there anything else? let me check over here. I don't want to miss a piece. Oh, yes. And it was about happiness. So they said that happiness is twice as contagious as unhappiness. So if you're, and it was somewhat related to geographical, to proximity, geographical, if that's right, proximity. So if your neighbor next door is happy, that gives you a boost of happiness 2 times. If the neighbor on the other side is unhappy, it gives you an unhappiness boost, or maybe you don't call it boost, but a decline of 1 unhappiness. So you're still, if you got 1 happy guy, 1 unhappy guy, you're still ahead 1 happiness. So, and it relates to neighbors and your friends, but it doesn't relate to somebody like on the other side of town or something. Or it had something to do with geography. But it was so interesting that it was the communicableness of it. And so I think, I don't know, maybe too Mary Poppins, but but I remember somebody said, if you're not happy, fake it. And smile. There's something about smiling that releases endorphins, or I don't know, one of those forphins in your chemistry, and it makes you feel better. Even though it's false, even though you're just putting even a false smile is better than a frown, apparently. I think once you get more of a density of that in the world, the kind of what some people call the addiction to materialism and relentless buying and all this kind of frenetic thing that we're caught in can ameliorate and be what's that word? Gentled. Could be gentled. I hope we do something like that. I just can't wait to see what the world. Well, I can wait, but to see the world unfold like that, and this time with everything being thrown out of balance and so apple cart upset is just so heavenly. I mean, so heavenly, you know, because we're even beginning to see the effects, at least here in Santa Fe. There's a place on Sila Road. I don't know about now, but when the pandemic was really going on, anybody could drive up in their car and get a free box of food. There's no income statements, income tax, no sort of nothing. If you made $100 million, you could go in and get a box of food, free box of food. And then there was laws were passed where you couldn't evict somebody for non-payment of rent. So you begin to see the beginnings of a society where kind of the basics are furnished. And you could also see a society evolve where people are taken care of, and then that inspires a generosity in them. And they want to go out and help other people. I could see some kind of a Craigslist, like the gas company said, well, we need people to volunteer to dig ditches in this pipeline we're putting in, or this connection or something. I go out, I love to dig ditches. 2 hours, no problem. Or we need people to pick up trash, or we need somebody to mind the kids here. We need whatever, any of that stuff. You could just have a kind of free-floating job thing where people, little miscellaneous things like that are just taken care of because people show up when there's a need. And it's in my health thing, like United Healthcare said, oh, volunteers, not as much as you can, but volunteer. Well, maybe as much as you can, because it makes you happier, it makes you more connected, it improves your health. So those kind of acts of what are thought of as selflessness, but actually make you happier and healthier. So like, who's winning or who's losing? Everybody's better off. So, so that's what with all my heart. All right, that's it.